I see a lot of other parishes going around, and they'll just try to do a project without actually doing any analysis on it. They're just say, hey, we see a problem, we're going to go fix it. But a lot of times there's these unintended consequences when you do that.
Greetings and thank you for listening to this episode of Stormwater Talk. My name is Jonathan Hill, and I'm responsible for communications and outreach for the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan. This is a production of the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan, Franklin Associates, and I'm joined here with my producer today, Christina Lacroix. The East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan and 20-year capital improvement plan seeks to identify flood-related risk, vulnerabilities, and recommend capital improvements to mitigate or reverse those risks. And to find out more about the Stormwater Master Plan, you can visit stormwater.brla.gov. You can also follow on social media at StormwaterEBR. On this episode of Stormwater Talk, my guest will be Jeff Doudrick with HNTB. He serves as the technical lead for the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan. Jeff, thank you for joining us on this episode of Stormwater Talk. And so if you would just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your role with the Stormwater Master Plan, and how you got involved in this work.
I'd love to, yeah. Hey, thanks for having me on. My name again is Jeff Doudrick with HNTB Corporation, working on the Stormwater Master Plan. We've been doing this here for a few years now. I'm the technical lead, so what that means is that I'm in charge of all of the stormwater modeling that we're doing, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about here today, and all the different technical things that go into putting together all the data and all the information that we eventually compile and get out as part of this project. So, yes.
So, Jeff, just tell us about your background as you've gotten involved in this work, your credentialing, your engineering background, I'm assuming, to do this type of work.
Yep. So went to college at the University of Memphis and got a civil engineering degree. So that's kind of the background in terms of education. I've been working in water resources for about 18 years. Yeah.
And so you mentioned your role with the Stormwater Master Plan as the technical lead. You're involved in all of the modeling, the data, everything it takes to get to a final product. And so can you just walk us through those steps? What does that data look like? How does that feed into a model? What is the model producing that gives us the information we need to create the Stormwater Master Plan?
That's a good question. So, in the end here, what we're really trying to do is figure out where we have flooding problems, because it's not always known where we have flooding problems. And, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from the public about, this street floods here or this home floods there. But we really need to get a big picture throughout the entire parish about where flood risk actually is happening. And in order for us to understand that, what we do is put together what we call hydraulic modeling, hydrology and hydraulic modeling. And we can talk about that a little bit if you want to, but basically what we do is we put together, just like you would put together a model of a car or anything else, we build a simulation of the terrain and the water that would flow over it so that we can understand where things are flooding throughout the parish. And in order to get to that point, there's a lot of data that we have to collect up front in order to kind of get to that point to where we can build this model out on a computer in the software that we have called HECRAS. We have to collect all kinds of terrain information, so that would be the ground surface elevation, for example. We have to collect things like rainfall information, stream data. We'll even collect structural information. So, for example, we'll collect bridge information. We have to understand where the bridges are, what the shape of the bridge is, because that impacts how water can flow through it. We have culverts and pipe systems all throughout the parish. We did a huge, massive data collection effort at the beginning of this entire project, which was unprecedented from what I've ever seen. At least we collected over 67,000 drainage structures throughout the parish, which is a massive number. So that took about a year and a half. So, we get this project started in 2018 timeframe, but it takes a long time to go collect all that data so that we can eventually build all these models out. So it really does make a difference, the information that you put into the models. I don't know if you've ever heard of the saying, crap in, crap out.
Yes.
That's exactly true, right? So if we don't have the data, we don't have the right type of data to put into these models, then we're not going to get a good result in the end, right? So it's a very long process of, like we mentioned here, getting as much data as we can, getting the right data that we need, so that we can eventually build these software models that help us understand where flood risk is and where we might need to do a project to help reduce that flood risk.
So you talked about the data, this massive amount of data that was collected throughout the parish, which was unprecedented to put into this simulation. And you talked about HECRAS. Can you tell us a little bit about HECRAS? What does that mean? What does that software do?
Yeah, so we actually ended up using, there are multiple softwares that we use, and so we have different models that we look at here. We have ended up with 3 different tiers of modeling, and I think you've probably heard that before, Jonathan. But
yes.
For those who aren't familiar, we have 3 different tiers. We did a very large model of the entire Amite River Basin. So this is a 2,000 to 3,000 square mile area that we did a model for. We call that a Tier 1 model. And then we stepped that down and did more detailed models. So that Tier 1 model is it's very rough, just gives us a big understanding of what happens during huge events like the August 2016 event, for example.
Now, that Tier 1 model, did that encompass the entire parish or just the Amite Basin area?
So there is a portion of East Baton Rouge Parish that is not within the Amite River Basin. It actually drains into the Mississippi River. That's kind of the northwestern portion of the parish. But we still did include that in that portion of the model. So we include a portion of the Mississippi River in this big regional model as well. But for the most part, it's primarily the Amite River Basin. So,
okay.
Yep. And so that is a HECRAS model, which you mentioned. That's a HEC is a program that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers makes, and what it does is it allows you to simulate. You put water in the model. You can build out this terrain, and then you basically dump the water on the model, and then it allows the water to flow through the channels and over the ground, and you can kind of understand where water is deep and how fast it's flowing, and all kinds of different stuff like that. So it really gives us a good understanding of where we have that risk. And we can even simulate historic events here. So not only do we do what we call synthetic events, which are, if you ever hear somebody say 100-year event, right? That would be a synthetic event where we just say it's about 16 inches of rainfall, for example, would be a 100-year event, a 72-hour 100-year event. And we can talk about 100-year as well if you want, but it's basically just getting us to the point where we understand where the flood risk is in the end. And so that's that Tier 1 model, but that's the big picture model, right? And then we do these other smaller models, which would be, for example, Clay Cut Bayou or Ward Creek. Those would be more detailed HECRAS models, okay? So that's what we call a Tier 2 model. We go into great detail with the channels and all the different structures throughout the parish, and these would be bridges and box culverts and things like that, so some of the bigger structures. And then we have an even more detailed model, which is a Tier 3 model. We call that Tier 3, and that is what we use. We use PC Swim, and that's HECRAS doesn't allow you to model a drainage system underground, like the smaller pipe systems with all the inlets, the storm inlets and things like that. So we have to use that program to help us understand how all of the enclosed drainage systems work throughout the parish.
So we have 3 levels of models that have been created just so we can understand how water is flowing throughout the parish as relates to the various terrain and within the various watersheds that the parish has. And so when you think about a watershed, because these models flow through watersheds, some of them are created for watersheds. What is like a basic or working definition of a watershed, and how does it work?
Sure, yeah. It's watersheds aren't any specific size. It's just a watershed is an area that drains to a specific point. Okay, so it can be any size. So, for example, the Amite River Basin, that is a very large watershed. The Mississippi River is a huge watershed, but you can even have a watershed that's only the size of a neighborhood, right? So it doesn't have to be any specific size. It's just, hey, this is the area of land that drains to this one point. That's a watershed.
And so you mentioned a key term when you talked about the model outputs and the simulations that you can create. One of them being the 100-year flood. And that has been a term that has been used quite often as we've worked with the Stormwater Master Plan and even shared information with the public. And so what is this 100-year flood that has been so often referenced, and what does it indicate?
And it can be very confusing, I think, to a lot of people. It doesn't mean that it would only flood once every 100 years. It means, and so it's a little bit confusing in that, what it does mean is it means there is a 1% chance of a flood in any given year. So every single year there's a 1% chance of flooding. Okay, so for example, in a typical 30-year mortgage, there's about a 26% chance of flooding if you're within a 100-year floodplain. So it doesn't mean that you would only flood once in 100 years. It means that there's a 1% chance in any given year. Again, a 30-year mortgage has about a 26% chance if you're within a 100-year flood.
So in any given year, you have a 1% chance of flooding. Mm-hmm. That's the basic definition of a 100-year flood. Now, does that 100-year flood or that percentage change based off the topography of the land and where you live?
So that isn't what dictates the 100-year. For example, I guess, yes, in a way it does, because you might have the bigger area that you have, or the bigger the watershed, the more water that would get to a certain point. So you would have a much larger 100-year flow, for example, from a big watershed than you would from a small watershed, if that makes sense. And I think, the other thing that can be somewhat confusing is you'll hear us, at least as we're going through the Stormwater Master Plan, we'll talk about a 16-inch, 72-hour rainfall is about a 100-year event, but we'll also say a 13-inch, 24-hour rainfall is also a 100-year event, right? And so this is where it can get very confusing, because there can be many ways to get to that 100-year event, what we call that 100-year event. So it's not just any specific rainfall. It has to do with how much rain falls, what is the duration of the rainfall, right? And so that total volume makes a difference. So there's kind of a few different things that go into getting a 100-year event, and it can be many different ways to get to that, if that makes sense.
It does. So let's talk about that a little bit. If you can say, what are those things that get to a 100-year event? Like, what does that consist of? So we know it's not 100 years is not a time frame, right? But there are certain elements based off your description that would equate to a 100-year event, and that could vary. Are there some? What do you all look at when you classify something as a 100-year event?
Right, yeah. and it's because it's very complicated, because it depends on a 100-year rainfall, or a 100-year rainfall wouldn't necessarily equate to a 100-year flood either, right? Okay. So just because you get a 1% probability rainfall event that happens, that doesn't mean you're going to get 100 years of flooding downstream, the 1% annual chance of flooding downstream. And primarily when we're looking at that, it has to do with the duration of the event, right? So you can have, like, the August event, 2016 event, for example, was a very long, drawn-out event. But you can also get these really short duration, high-intensity bursts like the May event. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you remember the May event, because we had 13 inches of rainfall in 6 hours. That's a massive. That was more than the 100-year event. But you also have to remember that rain is not evenly distributed across an entire watershed either. So it can be very intense in one spot, but not intense in another spot. So
based off that, you're saying that one area within the watershed, and we'll just say a neighborhood, could experience a 100-year flood event, and a neighborhood on another side of the watershed could not. Right. All in the same rain event.
Correct. Right. Oh. And then if you wrap all that together, say, for example, you have a big watershed, it may rain really hard in one area, but not in another. and you might not get much flooding downstream, right? So it might flood in one little small local area, but downstream it may not flood at all, right? It may not be as big of a flood. That's why I say just because you have a 100-year rainfall event happen in one specific area of a watershed, it doesn't mean you're going to get a 100-year flood downstream. That makes sense.
It does. And you talked about these various rain events that you all measured and used sometimes for the simulations, 13 inches and I don't want to misquote it.
24 hours.
In 24 hours. And was there a shorter duration as well?
That's the 24-hour rainfall event. So that's what we typically look at, and it makes a difference how we do this. So for example, when we're looking at those tier 3 models, which are the enclosed drainage system, the smaller areas, we're looking at street level, right? What tends to control flooding, and that's what we look at, what duration of rainfall, what depth, what rainfall volume controls flooding for different areas. And typically when you look at the smaller basins like the PC swim basins or the tier 3 model basins, so those are the street level kind of when we're looking at that stuff, those are typically controlled by those May event type rainfall events where you get a ton of rain in a really short amount of time. So it's a very, very intense rainfall. That's typically what controls for those smaller basins. When you get to the bigger basins, like let's say all of Clay Cut Bayou or all of Ward Creek, it takes a little bit longer for the water to get down to that point. And so that's why we use a 24-hour event for that one. So it's a 24-hour rainfall event, and it's a larger volume of water, total volume of water, but it's not as intense. And that's what controls flooding for those size events like a Clay Cut or a Ward Creek type size watershed. When you get into the Amy River Basin size watersheds, as you can imagine, it takes water a really long time to get downstream, days. And so that's where we try to stretch that out a little longer. So the bigger volume and longer drawn out events are what end up being the controlling factor typically for those size events. And then you could even get up to the Mississippi River. You can think about that. It takes a really long time for stuff to get down the Mississippi. So it may have rained, weeks ago upstream in the Mississippi River, but it takes a really long time for it to start flooding down here.
So when we talk about flooding, and if we can, let's try to get a working definition of that, because that term is used often. And when you think about on a neighborhood or street level, if the street is overcome with water, people will say that, oh, my street is flooding, which it's true, right? If water gets in my yard a little bit, people will say, well, my yard has flooded, even though it may not have reached the residence or the structure on the property. And so when you all look at these various simulations and you're looking at what you would define as flooding, do you all have a working definition you kind of use for that?
We do, yeah. We really are trying to focus primarily on where can we eliminate or substantially reduce flooding for homes and structures. Okay, so we understand that there is a lot of street flooding, and what we typically call street flooding, we will typically call that nuisance flooding. So it's typically not going to get in somebody's house, and in some cases we design drainage systems to flood the streets. Okay, but in some cases, if it gets too deep, that's not desirable. And typically when that happens, it just means that there isn't a way for that water to get out. So maybe naturally the water could have flowed out and down to the stream, but after development, maybe that there's a blockage or some terrain that keeps that water from getting out, right? But typically what we are focused on is reducing or eliminating flooding at structures wherever we possibly can. That's what we consider kind of that major flood problem. So that's where most of our analysis has been focused on, is where do we have homes or businesses or industrial buildings, hospitals, fire stations, especially those kind of critical, what we call critical infrastructure. Where do those things flood? And so that's where we have been focusing most of our efforts, is structural flooding, not street flooding per se. In some cases, we look at street flooding where it can be very bad, but for the most part, it has to do with structural flooding.
And so all of this data that has been fed into the models in an effort to reduce flooding for many in structures, and then you get this simulation, the output. And so how do you all use that output? What's the next step after that?
So, okay, that's a good question. So we model all of these simulations, and then we get what we call flood map from that. So it just shows you what the extent of flooding is, what the depth of the flooding is, so we know how deep it is. If it's really shallow, it's usually not as big of an issue as if it's 5 or 6 feet deep or something, right? So we focus on that. We focus on sometimes how fast the water moves through a certain area, and things like that. But we take those maps and then we overlay those maps with the building footprints. So we have a large what we call shape file. It's a GIS if people aren't familiar with GIS. But we take all the building footprints and we overlay the flood maps with that to help us understand which houses flood in which events. And then that's what we use to help us understand how much damage we might get from a flood. So we can say, okay, well, if this house flooded, this is how many dollars in damage it's going to cost to repair it. And then we sum up we add up all the costs of damages, and then we say, let's put a project together and that we can eliminate or reduce those damages. And if the cost of the project is less than the cost of all the damages, then we say it's a good project.
So the data that's fed into the models, we get the simulations with the goal of accomplishing one of the goals of the Stormwater Master Plan, which is this proposed list of projects. And so how do you select what projects would be implemented?
That's a good question. Okay, so as I kind of talked about a second ago, we're using the modeling. We take the flood maps, we overlay them with the buildings. We understand, for example, for every flood event we have, how much building damages occur, right? And that helps us pinpoint where we might do a project to reduce the damages for those structures or homes, like I mentioned. So when we get to a point where we have that information and we've developed a project that will help reduce the flood risk in a specific area, we can then kind of start ranking those projects against each other. So, for example, I think right now we're somewhere in the range of about 150. I think we started with about, it's probably more than 300 total projects that we just kind of threw at the wall, and we're just seeing what's stuck at the time. Then we go through a little bit more detailed analysis to help us understand, what benefit do we really feel like we're going to get. So we go model it, we do more analysis on the project, help us understand what the total, what will the benefit of this project actually be. So we go through all that analysis, and then we get to, we've developed a scorecard for every project, so that we can understand how we prioritize maybe one project over another, right? And we look at things like what is the resiliency of the project? Does it help low to moderate income areas more than another project? Is it resilient? For example, will it like climate change? If you think about climate change, will the project function in the future just as well as it does today, for example? And so we look at things like that. We look at how many homes, like what is the effectiveness of the project? Were we able to remove completely homes from the floodplain or not? So we have a total of, I think it's around 10 or 11 total kind of scoring that we do, and we come up with a total project score in the end. It wraps in all of the information that we got from those damages I mentioned, and how effective the project is at reducing damages. And then it comes up with a project score. And so in the end here, we'll have a list of somewhere around 120 to 150 projects that will be ranked in order of their kind of overall benefit. And then we have to take all those projects and we have to say, well, how are we going to pay for all these now, right? And so that's where the financing and funding piece comes into. That's the capital improvement piece of the project. And so that may change the order with which we do the projects. If we have funding available for a project right now, maybe it's 15th down the list, but we can pay for it tomorrow because we've got some funds over here that can pay for it. Then that might get done before the first project on the list. So it just really depends on how what is the monies available to do the project, and when can we do it within this 20-year capital improvement plan that's coming up.
Great. Thank you for that, Jeff. And so As we wrap up our time here in this episode, as the technical lead who has been involved in this effort since the beginning, and you've seen the models develop, you've seen the data input, and even to at this point developing a potential project list, what would you want our listeners to know based off what you've analyzed?
I think the one thing I would just say is that how important it is to have kind of the data to back it up. We've talked about this data-driven approach, and from being a technical guy, I guess I can say that, but I think it is very important for everyone to understand that, it does take time to do these things, and we've again been working on this for 2 or 3 years now total, and we're getting to the point where we've got all the data that we need. So this data, it's I see a lot of other parishes going around, and they'll just try to do a project without actually doing any analysis on it. They're just say, hey, we see a problem, we're going to go fix it. But a lot of times there's these unintended consequences when you do that. So I think it's really important, and I'm really proud of the fact that we've taken a step back here and said, okay, where is the risk? And when we do these projects, what is the benefit? But not only that, what is the possible downside of doing the project? Does it cause more flooding downstream if we do this project? So that's what I think is important to understand. This process does take time. It takes time to go analyze all this stuff and make sure that we're heading down the right path here. But I feel very confident in the end that we're going to have a really great list of projects that are really going to help reduce flood risk throughout the parish. So,
well, Jeff, thank you for that insight, and join us for this episode of Stormwater Talk. To find out more about the Stormwater Master Plan, you can visit stormwater.brla.gov. You can also follow on social media at StormwaterEBR.